Welcome back to the 9th installment entitled Know Thy Section 2. So this is the second part of the sub-series on mapping the thesis onto your paper and thinking critically about that process. And as we were saying before, the key point that we want to make here is that the claim matches the result. That is what we're after. But the action really occurs in the middle, in the execution phase. That is where you're painting the actual picture. So that being the case, we are making the point that that picture can be painted by way of dividing it into sections. Right? That we have a whole, and that whole we can divide into various sections, the size of which is your choice. But the point is that these sections systematically paint the whole. And the point that we said about sections is that they have to be able to address these three questions. A, they have to have a location, as we can point at the canvas and say, this is where this section belongs, how much space it's taking up. Second, it has to have one takeaway point, and only one takeaway point. There's a goal. As you're painting this section, yes, you're introducing your reader to a lot of things, but ultimately when your reader is done reading that part, they're coming away with just one takeaway point. And it is for you to craft that point. And third, because this is a section of a whole, we need to be clear on how that section actually contributes to the whole. How does it help paint the whole? That is the third. And we did it in the last video by way of this painting, right? This person was exhausted in the gym, and we illustrated how we can break it down into these three sections and then bring back the painting as a whole. Now we're going to do the same thing, but start with an actual thesis. So here's the thesis. By now, you should probably see this and look very familiar to you. The primary reason for the moral panic among the upper class during the British Industrial Revolution was the rise of the working class slums. And here's how we illustrated it visually in terms of its underlying structure. Now, as we said before, in the case of the British Industrial Revolution, even though it's a membership here, we're simply going to assume it as a background variable, so to speak. It is an underlying assumption that we're making that all of the objects and relationships that we're interested in here are all occurring within the context called the British Industrial Revolution. And so we're not going to include it. That is, we're not going to try to prove to you this membership. We're simply going to assume it. And so here we have our canvas with the picture that we want to paint. And now the question is, well, how do we go about it by sections? What we'll do is focus on just this one object, rise of the working class slums, and this relationship, cost. And we're going to build these two components by way of two sections. So let's take a closer look at this part that we're going to be painting. When we look at the object, what do you see? Well, you really are seeing two elements here. The first is working class. Well, what comes to mind when you hear this term class? It usually has something to do with your income, the type of activity you're involved in. Broadly speaking, the point is that if you're considered to be part of a class, whether it's the agricultural class, working class, industrial class, the upper class, it doesn't matter what the class is. But the point that we're trying to convey when we say these terms is that you and all the others in your category are, roughly speaking, engaged in the same activity. You sort of experience the same condition in life. So this is what we're saying here. Okay, well, what's the second element? Slums. Slums is what? Again, generally speaking, it has several elements to it itself. It's in urban areas. It's when people live very densely next to each other. And then the key element about slums is that they're characterized by poverty. That the people living in slums usually lack basic services. But now look what's happening here. We're told, according to what we've drawn up here, that working class and slums, when we combine those two, somehow, some way, that then causes something. Let's stop and think for a moment. We're saying that when we take one element, working class, and then the other element, we put them in one pot and we stir them up, all of a sudden, that chemical reaction that is going on between the two suddenly gives rise to this new character, this new element. Right? That together, they now all of a sudden have the power to cause something. Now, this is crucial. And in fact, we're going to be thinking about this very carefully. That we're not going to be taking for granted that simply working class and slums, of course, they cause something. No, you have to convince your audience of that. That is your job. Now, let's take a step back and thinking about the painting that we're about to paint. Right? We need to have these two things here, right? But we can juxtapose them. And that is, well, what's happening before Industrial Revolution? And then what is the Industrial Revolution? That is, we're going to understand the Industrial Revolution by way of comparing it to what happened before. And so on the left, pre-Industrial Revolution, we have this image that, roughly speaking, does the job for us. And that it illustrates, if you look at what the people are doing in here, right, they engage in agricultural activity. That is, people were primarily living off the land. So this is the agricultural class, as we would call them. And then the second, if you look at the towns that they're living in. So people are certainly coming together and living together, but you can see these are small towns, right? Now, if we then compare that to the Industrial Revolution, how the Industrial Revolution now changes, well, it's really in these two ways. The first is the type of work, and the second is the population density. As for the type of work, when we're talking about the Industrial Revolution, the revolution is really occurring in the ability to now produce things on a massive scale. We can reproduce things in ways that, quite frankly, we've never seen before. And we are able to do this by way of these machineries that are now being invented. Now, what is critical here is this mass production. The profit lies where? In your ability to produce something over and over again and therefore sell it for cheap. Give the masses access to stuff that they previously didn't have access to. And your profit margin is in this massive scale and your ability to sell it to more and more people. Now, how is it that you can increase your profit? Well, decrease the input cost. Decrease the amount that you're paying for the labor that is helping you produce the things you're producing. The cheaper the labor, the better. So when it comes to the type of work here, we're seeing this transition from agriculture to activities in which there's mass production, and that mass production is occurring with the help of cheap labor. So that's the first thing, the type of work. The second is directly related to it, and that is the population density. And that's because these industrial hubs that are forming along, well, access to the sea, access to preferable trade routes, right, where you can now distribute all of these products along the trade routes into different people around the world. And what that is now doing is it drawing on these agricultural areas, these rural areas, and bringing people into where the industrial hubs are. And so you see this transition from small towns to the rise of more dense cities across the various parts where Industrial Revolution took hold. In other words, you see a drastic increase in the population density. Down here on the right, you're actually seeing the city in Germany, Ludwigshafen. And you can already see, if you look closely, just how different it is from our picture on the left. Now here's another example. This is Birmingham in England. On the left, you have Birmingham before industrialization. On the right, you have it during industrialization. And you can see just how different the two are. In fact, it becomes even more clear when you're looking at the population density. So in this image, in this graph, we see on the x-axis the calendar year, 1500s, 16, 17, 18, 1900s, and so on and so forth. And on the y-axis is the population of Birmingham, actual number of people living there. And you can see right here around the time of the Industrial Revolution, there's this sudden spike in the number of people living in Birmingham. That the population is increasing rapidly. And the result of that is what we're seeing here. On the left, we see this painting and how dense, the kind of work people are engaged in. On the right, the kind of dwellings, the kind of places in which they lived in. And you can see just from this image how cramped their living quarters are. What we want to do now, or our goal here, what we're trying to establish, is to say that the working class slums, right? Well, these two elements here, working class plus slums, give rise to this thing we say, well, the ability to cause something. And why? Well, let's look at this here. Our ultimate goal is to paint this picture. That is, on the left we have the working class slums, on the right we have the upper class. And the key claim that we're making is to say that the thing on the left does something to the thing on the right. Cause panic. But before we even get there, because right now when you look at it, it almost states it as a fact. The thing on the left does something or did something to the thing on the right. But really, what we have to do is take a step back, a prior step. And in that prior step, what we have to establish is that the thing on the left has the capacity to do something to the thing on the right. Notice the key word here is capacity. Before you're able to do something, you need to first have what? The capacity to do it. If you don't have the capacity, well, then you're not going to be able to do it. Right? And so this is really where you as the author comes in. Your job is to convince the audience that the thing on the left has the capacity to do something. That is your job. And so that means when you're talking about the working class, you're not talking about the working class for the sake of the working class. No, you're not trying to educate your audience about the working class and its history. Your goal instead is to make a case of how the rise of the working class contributes to this thing we call capacity. That is your job. The same thing goes for slums. Again, your job is not to educate your audience on the history of slums. No. Your job is to make a case on how slums contribute to this thing we call capacity to do something. That is what you're trying to do. So that means when we're doing our sections, that is the goal we're going to have in mind. So let's start with section A, the working class. And as we said before, we need to be able to address these three questions: the location, takeaway point, and contribution. So as for the location, let's say we can find it right here. Second paragraph, first page until the end of second page. Okay? Well, what about the takeaway point? Well, let's think about this carefully. Here we have the working class on the top, and we're going to make our case by way of juxtaposing it, by way of comparing it to what we saw during agricultural times. But as I said before, we're not interested in the working class for the sake of the working class. But instead, we need to be able to make this case about the working class slums causing something among the upper class. In other words, we have got to make a case for the capacity. That is what we're engaged here. So we have to think carefully. How does the type of work that people are engaged in contribute to the capacity to cause something? That is what we are interested in. That is what we need to frame our section as in order to accomplish our goal. So then our takeaway point here is this. The Industrial Revolution was in desperate need for cheap labor. Notice in our takeaway point, we don't even have the term working class. It is not that we are uninterested in working class, that we're not mentioning the working class in our section. In fact, it's the opposite. But the point is that as we are talking about the working class, as we are forging our argument in this section, we are carefully framing it with this takeaway point in mind. That when our reader is done reading our section, they're going to say, I understand that the rise of the working class was contingent was based on this new industry forming and its desperate need for cheap labor. That is what created the working class. And why is that takeaway crucial for us, for our purposes? Well, it helps us paint a larger picture. How? Well, like this. The section set the foundation for the rise of the economically deprived working class. Whatever vices this class displayed was largely because of this inherent economic inequality. How are you seeing? Our takeaway point is laying the foundation about this term we said earlier, and that is capacity. Here we have the capacity being cheap labor, bringing people from the rural places into the urban centers. Had they paid them properly, had it not been cheap labor, but instead expensive labor, so to speak, well then guess what? The working class could have afforded good housing. The working class could have afforded all kinds of institutions like hospitals and so on and so forth. In other words, they could have had all of the benefits. But they did not have that privilege. Why? Because the way they were drawn into the urban centers was cheap labor. That is the primary catalyst, what is pushing people from the rural places into the urban places. So you can see already here, right? It's that cheap labor is critical for why we're starting to see these slums in the urban areas. So then here we have our section A. The location, the takeaway point, and the contribution. Now that we have this, let's move to section B. Here we want to do the same thing, address those three questions. But now we talk about slums. So where do we find this section? Well, the start of page 3 until second paragraph on page 4. Great. So now we know exactly how much space it's taking up on our canvas. What about the takeaway point? Well, we have to think about this just like we did before. At the top, we have our city during industrialization, and at the bottom, we have it before. And again, we're going to make our case by way of juxtaposing the top with the one on the bottom. We're going to talk about density, right, by way of illustrating it, how it differs from pre-industrial society. Now, the crucial thing, as we did before, is to again focus on capacity. That is what we have to make our case. So what that means is that we're not going to talk about slums for the sake of slums, but instead, our takeaway point is going to say this. Rapid urbanization places lower and upper class people in direct proximity to each other in ways never before seen. Notice, just as before, we don't even have the term slums in our takeaway point. You could, but notice that we don't even have it here. And the reason why is because our focus is to really make a case for what? Well, we see it actually in the contribution of our thesis, and that is close proximity, the inability to ignore one another. That is the crucial link for why the upper class was able to experience a sense of moral outrage. Let's think about this for a second. Again, we are interested in the idea of slums' contribution to the capacity to cause moral outrage. When we speak about slums, and we're comparing it to pre-industrial society, are we saying that there was no poverty in pre-industrial societies? No. That is ludicrous. In fact, poverty was widespread. So that is not the point that we're trying to make. It's not poverty for the sake of poverty. But instead, it's really that these slums are in these urban centers. And unlike in agricultural societies, where people are living dispersed, right? You don't live in close proximity, you live dispersed. Well, if I'm a rich guy, and there are a bunch of people around me who are poor, but they live miles upon miles away from me, well, do I care about them? No. And as the saying goes, out of sight, out of mind. I don't have to care about them. They don't affect my life. I don't even have to see them, right? So if you live far away from me, then quite frankly, I'm not going to be morally outraged. So in that sense, what we're getting at is proximity matters. And so for our case about moral outrage, it is not slums for the sake of slums, but it is slums bringing people, poor people, in close proximity with the upper class in ways that the upper class could not ignore. And it's that inability to ignore them that now is leading the upper class to feeling this sense of moral outrage. And so then here we have it. We started with our goal, working class and slums. And the key thing we're saying is we have got to establish, we have got to convince our audience of how these two elements, when combined, suddenly give rise to causal power, the capacity to do something. And so that is how we framed our sections, right? So in section A, we had the location, but the takeaway point being that the Industrial Revolution was in desperate need for cheap labor. And that in turn allowed us to make this, or lay the groundwork for a larger picture. And that is that whatever vices that this class may have displayed that ultimately sort of causes the moral outrage, well, that is largely contributable to the economic inequality. And the same thing we do for section B. Now here we're talking about slums. We have the location, we have the takeaway point, and as I said before, the takeaway point is not about slums, but about its close proximity, bringing lower class folks in close proximity with upper class folks. And that is now allowing, so to speak, for the upper class to become morally outraged in the first place. So here we have done it then. We have made it a point to convince our reader that working class and slums indeed gave rise to this power to cause something. And the critical thing here, and I cannot stress this enough, is this idea of framing our section. We are not interested in working class for the sake of the working class. We're talking about it, we're covering it by way of framing it for a larger picture. Right? So in our case, it's cheap labor that we want to emphasize. And the same thing comes for slums. We're speaking about population density really in terms of bringing upper and lower class people in close proximity in ways never before seen. That is our frame. And you always need to have a frame when you're constructing your section. Your frame is essentially the equivalent of the takeaway point. That's how it's, now everything in that section is filtered through this particular frame that you're constructing. So then with that, we've accomplished what we set out to do. We had our canvas, we wanted to paint this picture, and we did it by way of sections. And we saw how section A helped us build part of the picture, section B did another part, and then had we continued, you would have seen how section C would have helped paint the last object. And so then each section contributes to the picture as a whole. And the critical thing being is that they're able to address each of these three questions. They have a location, they have a takeaway point, and they have a clear contribution for our thesis. So with that, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.